In the studio, Aubrey Allegretti, the senior political correspondent at The Guardian. Hi, Aubrey, thanks for coming. And also, of course, the ultimate security expert, Will Geddes. So good to have you both here. So let me start with you, Aubrey. Dynamic, diverse, complex, China, Russia. It's a frightening picture. She's painting it on purpose. Why is she trying to frighten everybody at this point?
Well, absolutely. The government's obviously first priority is the safety of the nation and protecting people. And so what we've heard outlined by the Home Secretary are really the sort of myriad of problems that the security services have been facing in terms of tracking, trying to prevent and thwart these kind of attacks. We heard an update on the kind of 8 attempted attacks per year that the security services have managed to thwart. So she is trying to sort of paint the very broad picture and also make an interesting point about the threat of artificial intelligence to be able to help or be utilised by potential terror suspects. So she is painting this very, very broad picture and ultimately trying to say the government does have a plan. It's implementing things, for example, in the aftermath of the Manchester Arena bombing. But whether or not it works, obviously, we only sort of find out after the fact. We have to hope that nothing happens and the security services do their job, and we find out in the years after.
Let's turn to somebody who lives, eats and breathes this stuff. Will Geddes, it's good to have you here. When she talks about this diverse, complex, dynamic threat, terror threat, you put some flesh on the bones of that and tell me what she's talking about, because just leave it like that. It's the most terrifying thing to say, and nobody really knows what she's talking about.
Well, no, it's a good point, Vanessa. I mean, in terms of its complexity, it really is complex. So I'll give you one example. So we had a case very recently with an intruder who was trying to assassinate Her Former Majesty the Queen, who managed to get onto the grounds, onto royal grounds, and had been incentivised by AI and a virtual girlfriend who had tried to encourage him to basically give him the support, the confidence and the motivation to potentially go ahead with his plan.
Yeah, we covered that story, and people listening might not have grasped it, but essentially this was a guy who was turning to his AI girlfriend, which means not a person, not a robot, nothing he could actually see, but some kind of entity that he was communicating with. And when he said, "I'm an assassin," the AI, in inverted commas, girlfriend said, "Oh, cool, fantastic, great," and that kind of a thing. And so the encouragement from this AI entity kind of spurred him on to try.
Exactly. So this corners off that one area, which looks also to what we call the lone actors, which are the biggest concern. You've got your prescribed terrorist groups, which are like Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is rebuilding its confidence and its capabilities. It's been very strong in Africa, both the West and also East Africa, but they're building their strengths to potentially come into Europe and also to plan an attack. Now, they are in competition in many regards with Islamic State, and we're familiar with those guys. They never went away. Again, they've been building their capabilities, particularly across the crescent of Africa, across the northern parts, in Libya, Tunisia, various other locations there. And again, are looking to try and incentivize their supporters in Europe and in the UK to carry out attacks. And they're looking at principally London, Paris or Berlin to carry out a significant attack. Now, where the complexity also moves in is where we look at terrorist groups perpetrating attacks and then being supported by other state actors like Russia. So, for example, after some attacks here in London, most notably London Bridge and Manchester Arena, Russian social media, Russian capabilities were propagating various propaganda of Islamic State to basically get their message across. So they have a vested interest to undermine our institutions, our government, and even potentially elections when we're going to be looking at those next year, and playing into the hands of terrorists. So there are many, many different strands which the agencies are working incredibly hard. There are about 800 live operations running at any given time by the security services.
And Aubrey, do you have any kind of understanding of the attempts that have been thwarted and how they're thwarted?
So there's been very little detail on those. I mean, we understand in terms of the sort of the casework, if you like, of all this. The government said today about 75% or 3/4 of the kind of cases that they're looking at are sort of Islamist extremism, and the vast majority of the rest is far-right extremism. Obviously, the government is remiss to kind of get into the details of why, but there is going to be, to try and tackle one of the issues that we talked about, which was AI raised in the case, there is going to be this AI summit, which the UK has tried to mastermind in the autumn, which is going to bring together lots of other countries, and it will be dealing with, again, lots of problems, but part of that problem, part of the shared problems they'll be looking at, is this issue of tackling sort of terrorism and how to stop terrorists being kind of encouraged or being able to use AI to develop techniques to attack people or speak to other people and spread their propaganda.
And Will, in an instance of a successful thwarting of a terror attempt,
yeah.
I mean, obviously it's very complex, anybody understands that, but we don't really grasp the complexities of it. We know it must be incredibly difficult, but is it a conglomeration of intelligence from different sources? Is it, what is going on in order to foil or thwart that kind of threat?
Okay, so every case is different, as you can imagine.
Yes.
And Aubrey's made a very good point about how certainly bringing the resources together is absolutely key. It's a mosaic, and many of the plots that have been foiled at the very latest stages, because obviously the authorities need to gather sufficient evidence to then achieve a prosecution. Now, in terms of obviously the capabilities or how that picture comes together, if you like, there will be potentially human sources. It could be someone within the community. It could be a next-door neighbour. It could be a friend of someone who passes or reports information.
Do you remember that time the leaves turned a different colour? Do you remember that story?
I don't.
Gosh, I do. When the next-door neighbour noticed that the leaves, the autumn leaves, that the person was sweeping up weren't autumnal colours. They weren't brown, orange, that kind of dirty-looking green, but they were sort of grey.
Yes.
And it led them to realise that there was some kind of chemical. Do you remember that? The
Yes, I
presence
do
of a chemical.
recall
Remember
that.
I'm sure we
I
would
do.
have discussed that together at the time. And that was an example of, you know, when they say be vigilant, and you always think, God, what the hell am I meant to look for? What am I looking for? Vigilant about what? This neighbour was vigilant and did notice this. Noticed the leaves turning a peculiar colour, and somehow put two and two together and was able to alert police to it. Absolutely extraordinary. It's that kind of a thing. Partly, is it? That
partly, absolutely.
Tiny element of that.
Well, yeah, but again, that's a fantastic example, and I'm glad you brought that one up, because a lot of people don't really know what to look for.
Quite.
Or they feel, hang on, there's something suspicious. Maybe there's comings and goings by various individuals at times of day and night or unusual times. And it has to encourage, and we need to encourage members of the general public to report something through. It could be something, it could be nothing. But again, leave it for the experts to be able to deal with. Now, what is really important, and I hope Suella Braverman has really got a grip of this, will be obviously the reporting mechanisms, so people can feel confident to make those calls and for those inquiries to be dealt with in a sensible and timely fashion.
OK, various areas we haven't yet mentioned, although she kind of has alluded to it. We haven't mentioned Eastern Europe, and we do remember, don't we, in recent occasions where Eastern Europe's been a good source of guns, apart from anything else, cars and various other things. Either of you can answer this, but Eastern Europe plays a role in all of this.
It can do in terms of munitions. Sorry, Aubrey, jumping in there. I mean, in terms of munitions, in terms of weaponry, yes, there's a lot in the Eastern Bloc, certainly in the Balkan states, which can move, and certainly with the Schengen Agreement in place, you can get it right up to the borders.
That's right.
And these people smugglers, you know, they're not just bringing people over, they're bringing contraband of various different types, whether that be drugs, weaponry, all sorts of different other illicit materials which could potentially be utilised. Now, the threat, I think, which was quite good that Suella Braverman covered, and certainly, Aubrey, your publication did as well, is that a vast majority of the inherent terrorist risk is already here. It's not necessarily coming over on illegal boats across the channel. However, that's not to say that those conduits can't be utilised and exploited to arm and equip, obviously, those in this country who do wish us harm.
And then this huge force that we haven't referred to yet, China. Always kind of touted, particularly by Rishi Sunak, as this spectre of imminent terror, but none of us quite understanding what that could mean or what that might mean.
No, China's obviously been a very sort of tricky issue for the UK government certainly to get a handle of, because Beijing hasn't been sort of keen to be as kind of explicit, I suppose, in being tied to things like cyber attacks that Russian hackers very clearly have been kind of tied to Moscow and the Kremlin. But the UK government hasn't yet figured out exactly what its sort of posture is against China. Rishi Sunak obviously sort of shied away from calling it a systemic threat. Instead, he called it a challenge. The integrated review had to be updated before. So there'll be kind of, I think, a far greater sense from the UK that it needs to work more with its international allies to agree a broader approach to China, because China is in a whole nother ballgame to something like Russia when you look at the size of it, the scale of it, the potential knock-on effects, the economic impact.
OK, whichever way you look at it, Will, I mean, anyone just sitting at home or driving the car or whatever it was, watching this, listening to this programme, you can't help but be absolutely terrified. But it's a kind of amorphous fear because you don't really know what to do about it. And you kind of wonder, why is the Home Secretary saying this in this way to make us scared? But why does she want us to be? this kind of discombobulating threat. Really, really horrible. And yet what? What are we meant to do or think?
Well, I think to a certain extent we're becoming, certainly after some pretty horrific attacks that we had in the last decade, we are in a situation now where I think we've become slightly more attuned to the fact that terrorism unfortunately does prevail. It does form part of our lives. It may not necessarily be in the papers every single day of the week, but it's a little bit like the threat levels. I mean, we're at substantial right now, which means that a terrorist attack is likely, and those threat levels need to fluctuate. They need to adjust according to, obviously, the intelligence that's coming in and as to the levels of risk we're potentially, faced with. However, in the same regard, Suella Braverman raising this, again, raises our attention. And whether it be leaves, comings or goings or whatever, is something to remind us that we all have a part to play. We all have something to inject into the ultimate solution. And as hard as the security services work, and I've got very good friends over there who literally are working every hour that God gives, they do depend on members of the general public contributing to that solution.